The Venezuelan parliamentary election on Sunday is a farce. President Maduro has the country firmly under control. Despite untenable conditions, a change of regime is not in sight. For a brief moment there was hope in Venezuela that the end of Nicolás Maduro's dictatorship was near. On April 30th, 2019, the counter-president Juan Guaido tried to instigate an overthrow with several dozen soldiers who had defected to him. Guaido stood with them in front of the La Carlota Air Force Base in Caracas and explained in a video that the Chavist regime was falling. He called on the members of the army to rise up against President Maduro. But when the fog lifted over the uncertain situation the following day, it became clear that Guaido's call had been a bluff. Apart from this small troop, which mainly came from the Parliament's Guard unit, no other soldiers took his side. Foreign Minister Jorge Arreaza smiled at the uprising of a little more than 24 uniformed men, while President Maduro had over 215,000 soldiers and 2 million militiamen on hand. It should have been the last serious attempted coup to date, if you disregard the unsuccessful amphibious invasion of the two former members of the American Special Forces with around 60 Venezuelan soldiers who fled to Colombia in early May 2020. This group wanted to kidnap Maduro and take him out of the country, but they were intercepted by the Venezuelan forces before reaching the coast. Why can Maduro stay in power for so long, even though his government hasn't been able to meet even the basic needs of the population for the past 8 years? Poverty has long since reached large parts of the middle class. Observers estimate that around 90% of the population are now affected. A fact-finding mission sent to Venezuela by the UN Human Rights Council does not mince words. Their report, published in October, accuses the Maduro regime of serious human rights crimes as well as serious mismanagement and rampant corruption. The Commission has encountered numerous extrajudicial executions. They classify them as crimes against humanity. President Maduro and his interior minister not only knew about these crimes but also personally contributed to them. One cannot blame the Venezuelan opposition for having done too little in recent years to change the regime through democratic means. In the presidential election to succeed the late Hugo Chavez in 2013, the opposition leader Enrique Capriles was only marginally defeated by Chavez's designated successor Nicolás Maduro with a difference of 1.5 percentage points. The opposition claimed electoral fraud, but the electoral authority stuck to the result. The 2015 parliamentary election then turned into a triumph for opponents of the Chavists. They won almost 2/3 of all seats, but it was the last reasonable democratic election in Venezuela. From now on, Maduro excluded leading sections of the opposition from elections. This then boycotted the polls. Maduro had the opposition-dominated legislature overthrown by the Supreme Court, which was subordinate to him and which declared the most important decisions of parliament to be invalid. In 2016, the opposition tried to get Maduro out of office by means of a constitutional referendum to remove the president. Although several times the required signatures were collected, the vote was blocked by the government. In order to definitely neutralize the legislature, Maduro had a constant assembly elected in 2017, which, according to the basic law, also takes over the legislative work of parliament. The fact that a new constitution was never written shows that the Chavists were only interested in suppressing the will of the voters expressed in 2015. In 2018, Maduro was elected president for another 6 years in an international election that was not recognized by the opposition parties. The president of the still existing opposition-dominated parliament, Juan Guaido, was then proclaimed interim president based on a constitutional provision with an orphan presidency. Next Sunday's parliamentary renewal election could have given Maduro the opportunity to seek dialogue with the opposition again after years of conflict. The EU offered to send an observer mission on the condition that guarantees for a democratic ballot were first negotiated and the elections postponed for 6 months. This proposal was rejected by Maduro, which turns the elections without the participation of the opposition into a farce. Participation in the pseudo-democratic process has proven to be just as ineffective for the opposition as their alternative strategy of carrying out months of protests on the streets in 2014 and 2017. At that time, over 120 people were killed without the country's situation changing for the better, and that's the way it is. The strategy of Guaido, who had hoped for some form of American intervention, has also failed. Such is even less likely under President Biden. The president-elect has already stated that he primarily wants to make the American sanctions against the Maduro regime more targeted. Maduro's dictatorship is based on the army, which has been closely intertwined with the Chavists since the beginning of the presidency of Hugo Chavez in 1999, who was himself a senior officer. The key to regime change, therefore, lies within the armed forces. As long as the military supports the Chavists, Maduro is unlikely to fall. However, if they turn away from him, the end of his presidency should be sealed. But why does the army remain loyal to Maduro despite its disastrous track record? Many military officials are also likely to be dissatisfied with the Maduro government. Their families are just as struggling with the general impoverishment in the country as the rest of Venezuelans. Even so, there are numbers of reasons why you won't switch pages easily. The Chavists have been determined to promotions in the officer corps for the past 20 years. This selection, which was also influenced by ideology, formed a military cadre committed to Chavism. If there are deviants who would be dangerous to the regime, more than 1,000 Cuban agents take care of preventing a possible plot. They sit at key points in the security and secret services and protect the Chavez leadership, so to speak, as bodyguards from their own security forces. As a rule, this should not be necessary, especially with the senior officers. Many of them are involved in crimes such as corruption or drug trafficking and are therefore in the same boat as Maduro. They have no interest in the overthrow of the regime because in such a case they would face prosecution or exile. But even if a military man is seriously considering joining the opposition, he or she will weigh the risks carefully. The opposition cannot offer him any security. Exile would be the likely consequence. The opposition leader Leopoldo López, who was freed during Guaido's attempted coup in April 2019, had to seek refuge in the Spanish embassy and recently fled the country. Renegade officers and soldiers have been particularly severely persecuted by the regime in recent years. Even close former employees of Hugo Chavez received no mercy. The military should therefore continue to stand by Nicolás Maduro. If there was a moment when the army could have changed sides relatively easily, it was when Guaido attempted to overthrow. The fact that the troops did not defer to the opposition leader showed not only the outside world but also the uniformed men themselves that there was no potential for changing sides. And it probably doesn't exist today either, because the internal framework conditions have hardly changed since then. Internationally, too, the Venezuelan leadership can continue to count on the economic and security support from Russia, China and Cuba, which is saving the regime from total collapse. Despite the catastrophic supply situation and serious human rights violations, the chances of an early regime change in Venezuela appear slim. And if you want to stay informed, please subscribe to my channel. Have a look at my other channels. I'll see you in my next video. Viel Spaß!